Welcome to this episode of Global Health Insights. I'm joined today by two friends, Derek Yach and Mark Tyndall. Hello, Derek and Mark. Thank you for joining today.
Hi,
Hi,
Peter.
great to see you.
Hi,
And
Derek.
Derek and Mark are both incredible public health experts. And in particular, they have a deep expertise on the topic that we're going to focus on today, which is tobacco harm reduction. I've known both Derek and Mark for a while, and I think you'll really enjoy what they have to say. I wanted to just kick off to say that both of these friends have had so many different careers, and we will get into some of the ones that are most relevant a little bit later as we explore this topic. Anything you guys want to say at the top before we head into things?
Just so it's a wonderful privilege to join you both.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. So today we're going to talk about tobacco harm reduction. And I wanted to talk about tobacco harm reduction because that's one of those topics that, let's say, has not been fully embraced, to put it mildly, and we'll find out more about that by global public health people. But when we actually delve into it, we'll see there are a lot of lives at stake and a lot of good that can be done. Really, my latent goal is trying to bring, shall we say, the ideology and the reality into closer alignment here. And I think you'll see what I mean as we go through this. But I think a good place to start would be, what is tobacco harm reduction? I don't know, Mark or Derek, which one of you guys would like to lead off and just explain what it is?
Sure, I can give a stab at it. I mean, I came from a background of harm reduction, and I thought what I was doing with people using drugs that we consider illegal and dangerous, like heroin and cocaine and crystal meth, I was doing harm reduction. And the term tobacco harm reduction, when I first heard it, I thought was kind of stolen from the work that I was already doing. Um, so it is, to me, I'm quite used to it, and it's now ingrained in how we define what harm reduction is. And on the surface, it's a perfect definition of harm reduction. We're taking a behavior or an activity that carries quite a lot of risk, and we're offering an alternative that carries much less risk. So I think that certainly vaping and safer nicotine products are perfect examples of harm reduction. But as I say, when I was working in other drug fields, I thought we had the corner on the term harm reduction, and I was surprised when the tobacco people picked it up.
Thanks, Mark. And Derek, do you want to pick up from there and talk about anything you want, but also the specific
Yeah,
technologies?
yeah. I've always seen the tobacco harm reduction world as being, particularly in the realm of chronic diseases, as taking actions that would ultimately reduce harm, but doing it in a way that tends to be more incremental and absolutist and prohibitionist. And it acknowledges that, in the case of tobacco, that there are people who are going to want to continue to get the pleasure from nicotine that they perceive, or they'll continue some aspect, but at a substantially lower risk to themselves. And the first time I actually started seeing it being spoken about actually was way back in the 80s, when Sir Richard Peto would write about smoking less, going from 2 packs a day to a pack a day to 10 a day to 5 a day is reducing harm. That's harm reduction in its one form. Then a decade or so later, we saw Mike Russell develop nicotine replacement therapy, and seeing that people would continue to get nicotine, but without the harm of the smoke and the combustion and the carcinogenesis caused by cigarettes and by other products. And now we're in an era where we have
Sorry, Derek, is that nicotine gum, nicotine patches historically?
yes, nicotine gum, nicotine patches.
Okay.
And those actually were all examples of harm reduction. But generally, the smoker or the user of some of these products didn't and hasn't used them with the levels that we expected. And now, in the last decade and a half, we've seen an explosion of a wider range of nicotine alternatives that remove either the combustion or the toxic aspects of oral tobacco products. So that's vapes, heated tobacco products, nicotine pouches, snus. And even in the Middle East, we're seeing e-shisha, which is hookah, water pipe, taking out the charcoal and the combustion aspects.
Great. And I think of those ones, the thing people would be most familiar with would be vaping. but they won't think about it necessarily in the context of harm reduction. And that's what we want people to think about in the context of harm reduction. But it's not only vaping, also smokeless tobacco, you said, nicotine pouches, and then you mentioned a couple of other ones,
Yeah,
snus and
heated tobacco products.
yeah. So just to drill in a little bit more, I think people are familiar with vapes. What's the difference between vapes and heated tobacco or smokeless tobacco?
So, as I say, we've seen a real explosion, and having been deeply involved in tobacco control for many years, and we'll get into it, it was only a decade ago that I started seeing the upsurge in heated tobacco products coming out of Japan and Korea. And basically, they take a formulated product that looks like a little tobacco stick, put it in a device that heats it below the level of combustion, and people breathe in an aerosolized version of nicotine. That mimics perhaps more closely a cigarette. A vape, of course, tends to have a battery and some means also of heating nicotine, which does or doesn't come from tobacco. It may be derived entirely from synthetic nicotine, or it may be derived from tobacco, and it usually has some kind of flavor. Nicotine pouch is just a more sophisticated version of snus, which was the original Swedish product developed 60 years ago, which is tobacco certain format put into a little pouch and you stick it in your mouth. And again, the nicotine gets absorbed, and people who like sticking things in their mouths and absorbing it find that it got them off cigarettes and gave Sweden the lowest cancer rate in Europe. And there are a whole lot of variants. E-shisha, again, takes the tobacco, which is put into a hubble bubble or a hookah, one of the products of the Middle East, takes out the charcoal and again puts an e-vapor type element into it. And interestingly, while you say most people talk about vapes, actually the explosion in heated tobacco products has been quite profound. And millions now have actually quit or reduced their risks, their consumption, particularly in places like Japan, Korea, Lithuania, Greece. And we don't think of Greece as being a place people are moving out of cigarettes, but they are into these products. Whereas the US, UK, New Zealand, Australia have tended to, and Canada have been vape land. And then Northern Europe, Iceland, Norway, Sweden have been places where nicotine pouches took off first, but now they're becoming global phenomenons, including places like Pakistan even.
So the essence is you get the nicotine, you don't get the combustion, and therefore they're lower risk, going back to the point Mark was making originally about harm reduction. How do we know they're lower risk? I mean, we know tobacco is an
Yeah.
incredible killer. How do we know that these tobacco harm reduction products are safer?
I'll let Mark Kirk. Just one
Sure.
comment I would make is that, of course, by definition, we haven't had many of them, with the exception of snus, for which we've had for decades. The Swedish evidence, therefore, is the longest continuous record of knowing that as people use snus, we see the overall cancer rates drop to, say, the lowest in Europe. Overall mortality in Sweden is very low. Many other associations with tobacco, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease have reduced. With the others, while we don't have ultimate outcomes in terms of reduced mortality, we have some very good data now on exposure levels being dramatically down. So we know that the exposure to the cancer-causing components are down by 95, 98, 99%, depending what you look at. And the use of fairly sophisticated markers of outcome. So we're using biological measures that predict cancers or cardiovascular disease or respiratory disease as a proxy for what ultimately we believe will be reductions in death. And those proxies, based on studies of year 2 and many others, are showing dramatic declines in actual reduced harm. We obviously hope that it won't be long before we'll start seeing those translate into reductions in actual death rates.
And Mark, you've looked into this in great detail, I think, as well. Do you want to elaborate on that? The question is, how do we know that these tobacco harm reduction products are safer than smoking cigarettes?
Yeah, well, most of it to me is just common sense. So one thing we do know from having centuries of tobacco use, we know right down to the molecular level what causes disease, like what causes cancer and what causes heart disease. And if you take those chemicals out and those toxins out of the equation, then there's no plausibility. So to me, if you know what these toxins are and you eliminate them, the exposure, then it's pretty hard to make a case that anything will happen. So it's very frustrating to me when there's that basic evidence and people are stuck with the idea, well, they haven't been around for 50 years. How do we know that this isn't going to happen? And we don't treat anything else like that in science or new medicines or like, when something comes along, we design it that it's going to be an effective thing without knowing what's going to happen in 50 years. And it doesn't stop us from innovation. So to me, it's just so obvious that if you take away the toxins, then you're not going to get the same results. And now we've been talking about it so long. There's literally millions of people that have been exposing themselves to vape for 15 years. There's never been a death from nicotine, vaping nicotine that's ever been recorded. So, I mean, it's just implausible that the risk could be anywhere near what it is with cigarettes. And the other thing with all these products that Derek was talking about, it's not a continuum of risk. It's like cigarettes kill you and these other products do not. So often we're caught in this discussion about, whether heated's different than vaping, different than pouches. And there may be, very small differences in risk, but they're all way down on the level of the graph. And compared to tobacco, there's really there's no plausible reason that you'd ever argue that these products are going to be just as dangerous. Certainly they aren't now, and they just won't be in the future. And it's a really weak excuse to say that we can't be promoting these products because we just don't know what's going to happen down the road. Man, we basically do know what's going to happen down the road. And every year or every week that we refuse to promote these is literally hundreds of thousands of people getting sick. So it really, from a public health and a global health perspective, we cannot justify delaying the promotion of these products indefinitely until somebody's satisfied that we have 50 years of exposure data.
Clear. And I think what confuses people, and I just want to really draw it out clearly, is people think about tobacco, they think about the harms, they know that nicotine is in tobacco, and they think nicotine causes the harms. But what you're saying is nicotine does not cause those harms. It may be an addictive substance, but it doesn't lead to the heart disease, to the cancers. It's all the other byproducts of the combustion of tobacco, but it's not the nicotine that leads to the cancers and the heart disease. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think if we
100%.
go back to Mike Russell's original work, in the 80s, writing in the British Medical Journal, led him to formulate a number of our tobacco harm reduction products, nicotine replacement therapy. And we've had nicotine replacement therapy on the market for 40 years. I keep combing the databases for side effects of both the British MHRA websites and the FDA. So what have we seen over these 30, 40 years of people using nicotine replacement therapy? Because the nicotine in those products is no different from the nicotine in the vape or the pouch or the heated tobacco products. It's the same thing. And there is certainly no cancer risk. The cardiovascular risks are dramatically down. There are a range of, in some of the vapes, particularly early on, there was some concern about heavy metals because of the coils. Those are also down dramatically. But when Mike Russell said you don't die from the nicotine, you die from the smoke, and you separate the two, what Mike said makes complete sense. And that's what we've seen out.
Mark, did you want to jump in? It's the nicotine. It's not the nicotine. And I think that's where the confusion comes in for just ordinary people.
Well, as I've studied this more and, as I wrote my book, I, scoured information about this. And I was hesitant in my book to kind of place nicotine as actually a useful substance, but it definitely is a useful substance to people. And that's why they use it. And so there's really good information really good data that shows that it increases people's awareness and helps with their memory and their focus and reduces anxiety, all the things that people use cigarettes for. It's if nicotine was just just designed today and came onto the market, I think there'd be a lot of interest in how we can use nicotine therapeutically. But since it's now so associated with tobacco use and the dangers of that, then we haven't given it much thought, or we've just sort of tossed it aside. But it's a quite a useful compound for people. And there is some studies going on now with memory loss in older people, and it seems to be pretty effective. So
Yeah.
and helping kids and stuff. We're putting kids on Ritalin and all that. I mean, they'd probably do better with nicotine. But so, anyways, nicotine itself. I mean, as Derek and I are out there trying to promote this as a safer product, I have hesitate to get into being a kind of nicotine crusader, but it's really not the problem for people, and clearly it is addictive, which can be very inconvenient. It can be expensive. If people want to stop using it, it can be difficult. I mean, it's got all the qualities of other addictive substances, but it's not a health risk per se.
Got it. And I'm going to talk about your book in a second,
Mm.
and because that's a very interesting perspective, the way you transitioned from different forms of harm reduction. So let's hold that for a second. I'll come to that in a second. But before we do, just shifting then a little bit from what is tobacco harm reduction to what its benefits are. And along the way, let's just sketch a little bit the epidemiology of smoking. I'm not sure people understand just how great a health risk it is from an epidemiological perspective, and relatively speaking, relative to other risks. So, how many people are smoking now, and how many deaths does that lead to every year? And where I want to head to, of course, is how many of those could be saved through tobacco harm reduction. But let's just start with how many people are smoking and how many deaths does that lead to every year?
Well, I got
Good,
into
yeah.
this, first in South Africa because the numbers were so huge. And I was always hugely inspired by Sir Richard Dawell and Sir Richard Peter, who used to say to us, we really need to go where the numbers are big. And just to give the people who don't really look at the numbers. So today we have about 8.5 million people who die every year because of tobacco use. That includes predominantly smoking, but it also includes a large number, particularly in South Asia, who use a particularly toxic form of oral tobacco mixed with areca nut that causes a terrible form of oral cancer.
So 8 million deaths a year. And by the way, just to put that into context for people, there's 60 to 70 million deaths in total per year
Yeah,
in the
so in
world.
some parts of the world, that accounts for almost 20% of all deaths,
Yeah, and
depending on the
that's
aging of the population and so on.
yeah, and that's about the 8 million over 60 or 8 million over 70, but it really puts that into context. So that's a lot of deaths. And how many people are smoking to lead to that amount of deaths?
About just over a billion, 1.2 billion in total. And while the smoking rates, particularly in developed countries, have come down because of population, we're actually seeing a slight increase. And just to give you a sense that 8.5 million is projected under the best scenario at the moment without harm reduction to continue to grow to a peak of about 10 million per year because of the huge push of smoking over the last decade, that it takes time to actually see the deaths pile up.
Got
So
it. So
these are, compared to other deaths, these are huge.
8 million deaths heading to 10 million deaths on the basis of a billion people or
Yeah.
so smoking per year.
And that doesn't capture the disability. So,
Right.
almost all those people who end up dying of something else are debilitated in some way, whether it's fairly minor from not being able to go up a flight of stairs as easily to being confined to a room because they can't breathe at all. So a lot of people who don't qualify for those death statistics are still disabled by it. And when you look at like a country's productivity, if you're in the labor force and you've been smoking for 20 years, you're just not the same laborer that you would be if you didn't smoke. So, I mean, it has a huge economic toll and a huge quality of life toll on people who don't even get into the $8 million death
Yeah.
category.
And that disability point is really a very, very good one, and probably the clearest example of that, but by no means the only example, is COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.
Mm.
People might know that as emphysema. They might know it as chronic bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. That's almost 100% caused by smoking, right?
Well, probably about 70 to 80%. But yes, and I think the great tragedy there, and we all come from clinical backgrounds, is the harsh reality that about 70% of people smoke at the point of diagnosis of COPD. A
Mm-hmm.
year later, about 70% of people are still smoking despite being diagnosed with COPD,
Mm.
showing two things. One, the addictiveness, and second of all, the fact that physicians generally have tended to neglect people with a number of tobacco-related conditions because they believe it's either not much you can do about it, yet if you do switch to a vape or heated tobacco products or pouch or quit completely, your rate of decline of lung function slows or completely goes away or reduces dramatically. And the same goes through with many other of the tobacco-related conditions when you actually have the disease, whether it's cardiovascular disease or even early-stage cancer or tuberculosis, which in the developing world, about a third of the TB cases are associated or caused by smoking.
Okay. That really sketches out Mark's point about it's not just the death, it's the disability.
Yeah.
The deaths are huge, 8 million going to 10. The number of smokers are huge, 1 billion, and the disability is very, very significant, and you just sketched the spectrum of it. I find that a really good way to talk about these risks is how many lives you can save by addressing the risk, in this case through tobacco harm reduction. Because at the end of the day, it's not enough to describe something, you actually have to do something about it. And Derek, you've recently published a report that actually put a number on the lives saved from tobacco harm reduction. Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we got a
What's
group
the
of,
number?
the number is, well, first of all, about 100 million lives will be saved over the next 2.5 decades. So it's about 3 million a year.
It's between now and 2060, right?
Yeah.
So is that
And
35 years?
it's about 30, 35 years. So
Yeah.
about 3 million lives per year, which are lives saved beyond the current reduction in deaths that we're seeing due to a lot of good WHO measures, taxation, marketing, a bit of cessation, and so on. So we looked at what would happen if we actually had access to the kind of products that Mark talks about, plus heated tobacco, plus others, using a group of experts and using some very conservative assumptions over the course of the next few decades. I won't go into the detail. We also said that what's likely to happen over the next few years that'll affect the deaths is a dramatic improvement in lung cancer mortality due to better access to treatment. And that's probably going to explain maybe 20% of the gains. And I think I've been severely underestimating that. And
Hmm.
why did we choose lung cancer? Well, lung cancer accounts for about a quarter of the 8 million deaths a year that we see. You reduce that down to 1 million or less, and you start seeing really big numbers. So we started off looking at a number of very fine data and analyses for specific countries, 23 countries, and then extrapolated it by looking at the underlying smoking rates. And I won't go into the methods, it's in the report and a bit tedious to go into here. But I would say that we took a conservative approach.
Okay.
And the figure we have of 3 million lives saved then raises the question, so what are the other interventions in public health that come close? And vaccines are pretty much in the same ballpark. And your own work, Peter, suggests that GLP-1 agonists over time may very well be in the same ballpark, but there's virtually nothing else close.
Yeah.
And
The other thing
con-
in the same ballpark is treatment of hypertension. And
hypertension, yeah, I agree.
but it's a really important point, which is so 60 to 70 million deaths a year. You could save 3 million deaths a year from tobacco harm reduction, from vaccines. That's the number you save from all
Yeah,
childhood vaccines, about 3 million lives a year.
childhood and adult vaccines. So it's the full vaccination schedule.
From GLPs, potentially, that's a little more iffy because it's forward modeling, but it's a big number. And from the treatment of hypertension. But the point you're making, and of course, those things are somewhat interrelated, and sometimes you're saving the same deaths, but order of magnitude, there's nothing that saves more lives in terms of medical interventions. Maybe there's some broader public health things, but in terms of medical interventions, there's nothing that saves more lives than, say, about 3 million lives a year, which is a tobacco harm reduction. It's not the only thing that's at that level, but it's one of only 2 or 3 or 4 things that are at that level, which means we really have to take it very, 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 very seriously. And
And what the other,
yeah,
and it's something that governments don't even have to invest in. So if you
Right.
wanted to have a huge, vaccine program or a anti-hypertensive program or an obesity program, like these are things that require a lot of organization and money. This is just a simple switch over and it's just and the companies will do it on their own. Like it requires very little investment. So it's quite ridiculous that we have something with this much potential and we're spending our time trying to ban it and fight back when it'll just happen on its own if we just do it with the right regulations. And the beauty of this as a harm reduction tool is it actually is better for the consumer than what they're currently using. So when I offer somebody methadone, for instance, as a substitute for their heroin, it's not nearly as good. Like it takes away the edge of their withdrawal, but it doesn't get them high. It's a very tough sell to turn somebody over to that. But if you offer somebody a flavored vape as opposed to smoking a cigarette, most people will go, I never want to use a cigarette again. Like
Yeah.
this is way, way better. So we have so many things going for this as far as a public health transition that it's just so frustrating that, people like
and
Derek and I are fighting an uphill battle to try and convince people like the obvious.
well, that's what I wanted to ask you guys about, both starting with you, Mark, about that uphill battle, because you both come at this from different professional perspectives, and that's what makes it so interesting. So, Mark, maybe I'll go to you first and ask that question about that uphill battle. So, you come at this from HIV harm reduction, from addictions harm reduction, and you've written this book about your journey on harm reduction, and it does focus quite a bit on tobacco. You've got your book there. Do you want to just hold it up and we'll put it in the show notes? What's it called? It's called
It's called Vaping Behind the Smoke and Fears.
Okay, great. And we'll put the information in the show notes, but just talk a little bit about your journey through those different types of harm reduction to tobacco harm reduction. And then I want to really double down both with you and with Derek, because your journeys have been different, on why do you think it is that it is such an uphill battle? I mean, it's ridiculous in a sense that you could save 3 million lives a year, but it's not really, I don't know what the right word is, fashionable. I have my own little private theory about intellectual honesty in global health. But before we get there, I'd love to hear about it from your personal perspective. And just tell us the story of Mark Tyndall, focused on harm reduction, how you got to this, and include some of that righteous anger about why this isn't happening.
Yeah, well, I mean, I started with as an infectious disease doctor, and I was working in HIV, and my first big exposure was in sub-Saharan Africa and Kenya. And then when I went there, there was no treatment. There was barely any options to get a diagnosis, and the only thing we had was condoms. And so I was a condom promoter. And something looking back, condoms were discouraged. So governments and especially religious groups were thinking that it would be not a good idea to give people condoms because it would encourage young people to have sex. And for the people having sex, it would encourage them, I think, to have more sex. So
Yeah.
this was in retrospect when you have something that's basically 100% effective in preventing HIV transmission. To have to argue with people that people deserve this, and the failure to use condoms was so catastrophic. It was HIV with no treatment. Basically, it was a death sentence. I mean, looking back, it boggles my mind that I was in meetings arguing with government officials that they should have condoms in their clinics. 10 years later, I started getting involved with HIV prevention among people using drugs, and out somebody a clean needle. If you used a clean needle, it's 100% effective that you would not get HIV because it all came from somebody else's needle. Again, highly controversial. Same sort of argument. It would encourage people to use drugs. We can't give out clean needles. We're enabling people. Supervised injection sites, I was involved in that. I mean, people are, dying by themselves with dirty equipment, sitting under bridges and in alleys. And okay, we should allow people to go in a clean room and get a clean needle and be surrounded by people that can help them. Highly controversial, still is controversial. In the fentanyl epidemic that we're having in North America, people are buying drugs that are killing them. I had a program with Safe Supply. Okay, I'm a doctor. I can write a prescription for opioids. Here, take the opioids. Don't buy the stuff on the street because it's killing you. Highly controversial. The Safe Supply programs have basically been shut down in Vancouver. So, I mean, these things to me, is just so obvious that this is what we need to do with people, just ethically and just like in society. And I've been battling these for decades,
So
basically.
you're making an interesting point, which is every harm reduction program has pushback, and
Yeah.
you sketch that clearly. But then what took you to tobacco harm reduction? And would you say that pushback is greater, less, or just par for the course?
Well, I got into it just very, it's quite an interesting story. I was in Ottawa working. I had a cohort of about 600 or 800 people who were HIV and using drugs, and we were following them for adherence to their medication and looking for health outcomes. And the only bad health outcomes we're getting was tobacco related. So we were doing nothing for smoking. And when I was, filling out my annual, reports about what was happening to this population, it was lung cancers, COPD, and heart attacks. It wasn't HIV or overdoses. And that's what I was so concerned about. And so it made me think, well, most of the people, pretty much everybody in my cohort who was using street drugs was smoking. Like close to 100%. It's tied very closely in with people who are using other substances, and it's for them is a type of relatively accessible pleasure, and almost a harm reduction. I get up in the morning and I'll have 2 cigarettes before I go score heroin, is most people's routine, and so it was kind of cruel to take away their cigarettes. I mean, that was what kept them going. And then I heard about vaping about 2011, and I started introducing it to some people in my cohort, and they liked it. And I wrote an op-ed in the Ottawa Citizen in 2011 and said that this was like a breakthrough, like we should be doing this. And if you had told me like 13, 14 years later, there'd be less, there'd be less support than there was back then. I wouldn't have believed you. Like, it was just, to me, such an obvious intervention. So I sort of fell into it by working with people using other drugs. And to me, it just seemed like the obvious. And it's so, just my last point is what makes, when I was advocating for these other things, most of my colleagues, even if they didn't really believe that was effective, or they did believe it's enabling, they were still not antagonistic. Like, well, okay, you're doing a good job. I can see your point of view, good for you kind of thing. But with tobacco, all of a sudden I'm like a pariah because there's companies involved in this, and there's an economy involved in it. And all of a sudden I'm no longer a guy with a difference of opinion of my colleagues. I'm a guy who's like evil because I'm promoting tobacco companies. And I'm like, so it really changes the whole approach. So instead of being a good guy who might have a bad idea, now I'm like a evil guy who's got like a terrible idea. So it's really fascinating when big tobacco is kind of involved in the background, that it changes everything, basically.
And that's super interesting. So what you're saying is that the worst backlash is on tobacco harm reduction because it's people went after you personally, use the word pariah. I just want to point out that when you were doing these harm reduction things, you were actually doing them from inside the system. I think you were the deputy public health officer, or just flesh that out.
For the last, for 5 or 6 years. But I was in an academic position, and I was doing the work through grants that I was getting academically and things. So
But you also had a position in public health in British Columbia.
Eventually, for about the last 6 or 8 years kind of thing, I was a deputy provincial health minister and the head of the BC Centre for Disease Control for about 5 years.
Yeah. So even though you were doing these things and the harm reduction things kind of from that perch, you still got the personal blowback. And maybe the last question I want to ask you, and then I want to turn to Derek, because I think he got it even worse than you, but we'll see in a second. The last question I want to ask you is, where does this pariah status come from? Like, what do you actually notice in your life? And I'm not asking you to name names, but what kind of people what do you actually experience that makes you think that people think that you're a pariah?
Well, I'm not
Your
invited
words.
to things, right? So for instance, in Canada, there's an annual tobacco conference run by the Canadian Public Health Association, and I'm not invited. So that's, I just wrote a book. Like, nobody knows more about vaping in Canada than I do. I spent 2 years doing this, but in their national meeting, I'm blacklisted because I'm promoting vaping, and I've had an association with a vaping association in Canada. And so I'm, and for, I guess from their perspective, I'm only in it to make money, and which isn't true. Hasn't happened. But that's how I'm labeled. Is I don't have all my credibility in public health and harm reduction is thrown out the window because somehow I'm only in this now to enrich tobacco companies.
Mm. And words like pariah and blacklisting,
Mhm.
those aren't words that one does or should associate with normal intellectual and scholarly discourse, which is all you're actually trying to do.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to draw that point out because, there are some areas where you can really ask yourself how intellectually honest public health is. And this is one of those areas. And I want listeners and viewers to hear those words, pariah, blacklist. That's not the way science should work,
Yeah.
but it is the way that it is working in this field. And if you had it bad, wait until you hear what happened to Derek.
Yeah.
So, Derek, take us back to your initial work. I mean, you were one of the pioneers, and this is like the weirdest, craziest thing. You were one of the pioneers, or the pioneer, on the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is still the only convention that WHO has ever passed, the only treaty. There's different forms of international law. The pandemic treaty would be a second one. So you were instrumental in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that actually got this whole system rolling. And by the way, saved many lives from the measures there around tobacco, some of which you were starting to talk about before. Pick up the story then. I guess that was in the
Yeah, so it was the late 90s, and people often forget that the real driver, actually, of the Framework Convention was the country the two of you are from, Canada. The Canadian government was stunningly supportive at the time in the late 90s. It really was the world leader in tobacco control. It was one of the first countries ever to put their finger on the growing non-communicable disease epidemic. It started the question of saying, well, you're not going to make progress on tobacco unless we look at the transnational aspects, marketing, research, trade, and so on. It happened at a time when Gro Harlem Brundtland became the Director General of WHO, and having been the Norwegian Prime Minister and previously Environment Minister, who gave us many of the environmental treaties, she understood the political value of having an international treaty, that it wouldn't just attract the attention of the health ministers, or in the case of environment ministers, but the head of state, and it would commit the whole machinery of government. And so she used the environmental treaty background as a strong rationale to then have me come on board and start the early work in the Secretariat of developing the treaty.
And you came on board as an assistant director general at WHO at that time, and one of your primary responsibilities was to develop this
Yeah.
Framework Convention on Tobacco Control Treaty.
So, I mean, there were a couple of things we knew, and I think what makes it, in sort of looking backwards, you can always look at where the origins of the distrust for the framework for vaping coming from, and partly it was the work that we did. We had a UN investigation into the tobacco industry as we started the work, which showed that tobacco companies had indeed had a really long-term goal of making sure that countries around the world did not go ahead with taxes and bans and advertising. And that was the only report ever done by a UN agency into a corporate sector. And it did highlight many of the nefarious activities on lobbying. And it really came at a time when there was incredible distrust for anything the tobacco industry did or said. It was the era when the CEOs of the company went in front of Congress and, put their hands up and swore to tell the truth, and then said that tobacco is not addictive. And a lot followed from that because the lingering effect of that distrust continues today. Some of it remains entirely justified because we are still selling a huge amount of combustible cigarettes around the world. The majority of sales in most parts of the world of tobacco nicotine products are still those which kill you. So on the one hand, I can understand the kind of resistance that people had when some of us said, well, maybe we're going to head into a transformation. Maybe these products are going to lower risk dramatically in the way Mark explained. And well, maybe not. Maybe this is actually just the next trick. We saw it with the efforts around low tar, which initially looked good and then turned out not to have the desired impact. So when we started the work on the Framework Convention, I always remind people that right at that point, and you will remember, so go back to 1998, 2000, there were two mega issues in global health going on at the same time. There was the work on the treaty, and then there was the Doha round addressing the patent issues around HIV/AIDS, which benefited Mark's work dramatically. And the big debate was, how do we ensure that the innovation of the pharmaceutical industry becomes available to low middle income countries? How do we address the pricing structure so that the poorest countries would have benefit to the best innovation? And many of the same countries and the same people involved in the negotiation would go to a WTO meeting and look at the power of the innovation to save lives. Yet we, on the treaty side, didn't have the word innovation anywhere in the structure of the Framework Convention. And we basically sealed the science at the point when the negotiations started. Because in the minds of many of the negotiations, there was no imagination to believe that there would be true innovation coming out of a dirty legacy tobacco industry. It just was not thinkable. Even though we had the scientists from the industry come to the WHO headquarters at the start of the process saying, well, maybe we would be able to innovate, and we had the door open by keeping harm reduction as part of the definition of the Framework Convention. So basically, we in public health took our eyes off what then became a massive upsurge of investment in R&D and innovation, and billions of dollars was being poured into the evolution of science. And it was happening at a time when we were seeing the transformation of other dirty legacy industries, the oil and gas industry, the motor vehicle industry. And over the course of the last decade and a half, these very dirty legacy industries are undergoing a similar type of transformation to what we're seeing now in the tobacco industry. Electric
And the
cars.
Framework Convention was ratified and adopted in what year?
In 94, 95. So it was actually adopted by the World Health Assembly, I think 2000 and, I'm just going to get my years right, 4 or 5. And then it
Okay.
came into force around that era. So 20 years ago.
And the type of things it did was it set the framework, as I understand it, for, first of all, no dealings between public health and
Yeah,
industry. And I'll come back to that in a second. But also, it set up the framework for the types of very common and effective public health measures that are used on tobacco: front of pack labeling,
taxes.
smoke-free bars, tobacco taxes. These are effective public health measures.
Yeah. And they were all measures that had been in effect by the leading countries already by the late 80s and 90s and known to work. You raise the excise tax within limits, you will lower consumption. The work of your great Canadian David Sweener had shown that already from the 90s.
Yeah.
You ban advertising and so on. Yes, so those measures are in effect. The problem, though, is that
Yeah.
the adaptation of them from a Geneva environment to the streets of India or Pakistan or Indonesia is quite a big leap of faith because you need a lot more than simply text on a paper as opposed to resourcing on the ground.
Yeah. But for the purposes of this conversation, let's just say that that framework convention set into motion a number of public health measures that actually did save many, many lives.
Absolutely.
And we should be very positive about the framework convention. But the one thing in there that you told me about is you said there's a clause that kind of set up this ideology, which led to Mark's pariah status and blacklisting and led to what we're about to talk about in your case. There was a clause in there that said the interests of the industry and public health were irreconcilable, or words to that effect.
Yeah, there's the view was that there was an irreconcilable difference between the interests of the tobacco industry and public health. And that then was used to justify the exceptional measures to say, do not engage and so on. The actual text of the treaty, this famous clause 5.3, basically is a conflict of interest alert, which is no different from any other conflict of interest. Make sure that you take account of the fact that the tobacco industry has a different set of interests. And that's all it says. It then got elaborated in guidelines and got interpreted way beyond that into prohibitions and bans and individual bans and exclusions from meetings and conferences and so on.
And you could still argue that when the industry was only making products that killed people,
Yeah,
that wasn't completely, that would have been appropriate, actually. Or wouldn't
absolutely
it?
appropriate. Yeah.
But the point of this discussion is that situation has changed. You were talking before about the innovation. We're talking about vaping. We're talking about smokeless tobacco products. So in terms of the promotion of those harm reduction things, it's not so irreconcilable, maybe, but you still suffer the personal consequences. So now tell me a little bit about those. Derek, are you a welcome person in Geneva and in conferences? Mark's got blacklisted and not invited to conferences. What's your experience been?
Yeah, as I said, I've got a thick skin, and I just I've learned not to be too upset about it. But it was pretty tough when I launched the foundation to address harm reduction. My own WHO colleagues, many of whom I hired, basically said you'll never be able to walk back into the building again. And exceptionally, the executive board issued a fatwa against the foundation, saying there should be no engagement, no discussion. The conferences that I had organized in the past, including the World Conference in Cape Town, I was banned from participating in. But it's not, I don't want it to be about me. It's about the whole world of folk in harm reduction are not able to attend conferences if they have any link, however vague, with tobacco industry, or even increasingly with harm reduction, and put out the kind of messages that Mark's putting out. And that includes the journals. The British Medical Journal took a very strong stance, banning people from writing in its suite of journals. So that's the leading tobacco control journal plus the BMJ itself, which means that the public discourse is limited because you've got these two silos of academic scientists who regard it as having pure thoughts and continuing down the path of the status quo. And you've got a whole lot of innovative scientists. Many have no link to the tobacco or vaping industry, doing this incredible work on the role of vapes and nicotine pouches, who are unable to engage and look at what are the best solutions for their patients and for public health. That's the real loss, not what happens to me personally. And I look at some of these colleagues doing fantastic work, whose voices are not actually then able to get into the policy discourse to say, how do we save lives more effectively in the way Mark is talking?
Well, the real loss is the 3 million lives a year that could be saved that aren't saved. But I have to tell you, when I saw you around Geneva and stuff, the literary image that came to mind was that novel by Nathaniel Hawthorne from 1850, The Scarlet Letter, where a woman who'd had a child out of wedlock was essentially shunned by the Puritans and had a big red A for adultery emblazoned or branded actually on her chest. And you reminded me of the scarlet letter of tobacco. I thought you were walking around with a big T branded on your forehead, the way you were sometimes treated. But as you say, it's not only about you, it's also about the 3 million lives a year. By the way, just before we move off this bit and into the future, because we're running a little, you raised it. You guys aren't paid by the tobacco industry. Let's just put that issue out in the open. You said you spoke a bit to this, Mark, and why don't we just deal with that directly? Because people will come at your intellectual arguments with that.
Yeah, no, but I'm kind of stuck. I think that my message is important. My credibility is important. I shouldn't be advocating for free. I could do, right now I'm just volunteering. I'm looking for opportunities to, move this forward, not just a volunteer individual, but as a group. What Derek had created with the foundation would be exactly the kind of thing that I should be supported through.
Smoke Free Foundation is
Smoke Free Foundation or something like that. It's so ironic to me that if the transition should be funded by the tobacco industry, that government shouldn't be, foundations shouldn't be doing that. We should be charging the tobacco industry for this, and this master settlements that countries get with billions of dollars. I mean, that should be used towards getting people off cigarettes, I think, and funding people to help to do that. So,
Mm.
but all that's off limits to anybody who's advocating for safer products. So I'm kind of stuck. And ethically, I really have no problem taking money from a tobacco company. I mean, if I can help them transition, but it just further cements the isolation that I'd feel from my public health world and colleagues. So I've talked to Derek about this, so what's a poor advocate to do these days? So, I mean, so I have ethically, I think that what's fascinating to me, like some place like Philip Morris, if you go to their website, it's so much more forward thinking than anything WHO or CDC or these charities put forward. Like they have
On this harm reduction issue, you mean?
they have a plan. They'll get rid of their cigarettes. This is the way they're going to do it. Let's make them do it, and promote them to do it more. And then when you confront them about it, though, they blame the WHO and policymakers around the world from slowing their vision down. Like they're all for it. And that's why I say it's so ridiculous that we're spending all this time trying to stop this innovation when it's going to happen if we get out of the way, and but we're spending all the time trying to block it. So I think these countries should be encouraged to do it. If I was working for Shell Oil to get off their oil and gas, people would be going, yeah, that's great. We need people like you to do that. Or forestry industry to stop chopping down big trees. I mean, yeah, get in there, try to get them to stop it, But somehow we've made this red line in the sand, and and if we really are serious about this, tobacco industry is the one that can make this happen in a timely fashion. Like we could with legislation, instead of discourage them from newer and innovation and disruptive products, we should be really making them do it quick. Like this idea that in 10 years they'll be smokeless. No, you should be smokeless in 3 years or 2 years. Like we got to do it. Like the reason that you could argue that it would be ridiculous to tell companies to stop making cigarettes tomorrow is that that's so ubiquitous. There's already in Canada over half cigarettes aren't sold commercially anyway. So there's such an illegal thing. So if we all of a sudden cut off manufacturing commercial cigarettes, we just turn the whole industry over to the illegal gangs, and it's already happening. So, and we don't want to do that with vaping. So we really need to do this in a thoughtful way, but there can be ways to really pressure companies that we got to transition out of this and we got to do this quickly, and lives are at stake.
And Derek, you had a firsthand experience with this, and we won't go into detail on the Smoke-Free Foundation, but you're not there anymore, et cetera.
Well, I went as far as speaking to some of the leading bioethicists about the bioethics of harm reduction and something, and even speaking to some of the religious leaders I respect to say, what are you supposed to do in this setting? And I read my ethics as saying, you are compelled to save lives. It's not an option. Certainly according to, I'm Jewish, my religion, you are required to do what you can to save a life. It's one of the holiest things you can do. And if that means working with what some people paint as the devil, then you have to do that. But the question is, who's the devil these days? And just to put things in context, we now have 140 million people around the world who voted to use vapes, heated tobacco products, and snus, and all of these things. The consumers aren't fooled by this. They are demanding and moving ahead. I get invited, and I accept, and I participate in industry conferences where I just pray that my public health colleagues would come. Just in the last couple of weeks, I was in one where the heads of some of the leading companies gave speeches about their commitment to ending smoking that I thought sounded like a WHO meeting should sound like. But it was different from a WHO in that it's backed by massive investments in research, outreach, programs, plans, supply chain efforts to reach people around the world. And so I really think that the inability to talk, to actually allow the best scientists on both sides to engage, is actually being done at the cost of the deaths that we have today. The more we engage, the more we will make progress.
And why do you think people are so reluctant to engage in intellectual discussion?
I think there's
Or to push back
unfortunately,
against you personally, one or the other?
yeah, no, I mean, I think that now there's unfortunately, we have got a major philanthropist, Bloomberg Philanthropy. It's no secret that one of the first things he did when he started investing in tobacco was to create a large fund called Stop, run out of the University of Bath, which has as its main goal to list people who have any links to the tobacco industry, to harass them, change their careers, put pressure on them, stop them publishing, and make a very difficult schism between those advancing harm reduction, who may or may not have links to the industry, and the rest. That amount of money, plus the $1.6 billion that is being put into NGOs and media and activism through WHO directly and indirectly, is a huge incentive for people not to associate with anyone involved in the harm reduction space.
Mm.
It's unlike anything in any other area of public health that I'm aware of, where you have an active effort to actually block dialogue. And I said, it all goes back to, was on the one hand understandable then, 20 years ago, that there was an irreconcilable difference. Well, fast forward to now the wording of the US FDA, when it authorizes a vape or heated tobacco product or snus or pouches, what's the wording that they have to meet? Appropriate for the protection of public health. So they take the balance of science and have to answer this fundamental question: putting this onto the market, will it be appropriate for the protection of public health? And they put many products onto the market, which means that there cannot be an irreconcilable difference anymore between the interests of public health and industry, certainly in the case of those products. And if that applies in the US, it must apply worldwide.
And Mark, same question to you. You answered this in part before. Why do you think people are so reluctant to engage?
Yeah, well, we're dealing with the legacy, like Derek said. I mean, I wonder what the world would look like if Johnson and Johnson, who makes patches, were the ones who came up with vaping. I think we'd be in a much different space. It's a pharmaceutical company.
Great.
They would have brought it up in a very traditional way with clinical trials. Vaping came from the ground up. It didn't go through the rigorous sort of pharmaceutical type rigor that FDA is used to. So it can't be reined in now. Those trials will probably never be done now, or it's be very impossible, very hard to do them. So since it didn't come through like a big pharmaceutical company, I think we're in this problem now. And I really, they're jumping on the gums and lozenges, and like somehow we, in Canada, we're blocking nicotine pouches, but it's okay to chew gum and suck on lozenges if J&J does it, So it's really quite ridiculous. And the vaping part of things, certainly, if it hadn't have come through the channels it came through, which was from kind of grassroots, nothing to do with industry. If industry said they've been trying to create safer products for decades, they're either terrible at innovation or they really weren't that interested, because they haven't, they've really stepped up now when they saw their industry in trouble and this disruptive technology, and they've jumped on board and they're pushing ahead, which I guess is great, but that's not where it started from. So we're dealing with the legacy of big tobacco for the most part. And if you go into a vape shop in Toronto or Vancouver, 80% of the products aren't anything to do with big tobacco. I mean, most of the vaping companies and liquids do not come from big tobacco companies, but somehow the public's and governments have been made to believe this is some big conspiracy theory, but it really was never like that.
With vaping, you're balancing, or people frame the debate like this, you're balancing the benefits of harm reduction to current smokers. Let's just stipulate that those are there, as we discussed, the 3 million lives a year. But there's this argument on vaping of a gateway to starting kids on smoking down a path. Do you want to just respond to that? And then that'll get us into the question of what countries are doing this well and what you see in the future. But that's a common argument against vaping as a tobacco harm reduction strategy. Would you like to just address that? And then we'll blend into how different countries, maybe you want to actually talk about that now, how different countries regulate that balance and what countries do it well, maybe what countries do
I
it
can
less
talk about it
well.
quickly. I'll give Derek the forward thinking part of things. But yeah, I mean, the one thing we have had long enough is to know that vaping is not a gateway. So, in
Yeah.
North America, where most of the focus was with youth vaping, smoking rates are at historical lows. So if
Mm.
somehow those 30% of high school kids who try to vape, all of a sudden a proportion of them turned to smoking, we would have seen that in the statistics. That just didn't happen. In Canada and the US, it's pretty clear that vaping among young people peaked around 2018. There was a huge social media bonanza about this, and different influencers got there. I think some companies were behind some of this promotion to young people, and it did have an explosive effect as far as trying vaping. But the numbers of kids who were regularly vaping or maybe nicotine dependent was confabulated or kind of conflated with kids who tried. So clearly, when something new comes along, just like cigarettes, cannabis, alcohol, all these other things that we're so concerned that teens are trying, it was up there and kids tried things. But the number of kids who are even trying it now who claim to have used vape in the last 30 days is every year it goes down in North America. And it went from a high of like 27% have used in the last 30 days to like 13% or something. So there was a bit of a jump there, but it's gone down. And as far as gateway, we basically disproved that theory because there's just not very much smoking going on in North American youth anymore.
Okay, that's very clear. Derek, looking forward, you've looked at the regimes in different countries, and some are good, some are less good. Which countries do you think are models that people should look at on tobacco harm reduction? In other words, taking advantage of that 3 million lives saved globally per year, be a smaller number in any given country, but which countries are doing this well, and what are the characteristics of those regimes, and what are the models that people should look at?
Well, there are many, Peter, and I think I'm very bullish, very excited that I think, first of all, the consumers are making these demands. So, starting with, I think one of the purest examples of where the harm reduction principles that Mark laid out are being applied to tobacco is actually the Czech Republic, where in the office of the president, you've got a harm reduction strategy at the highest level, the president's office. And that is inclusive of hard drugs, tobacco, gambling, and a range of other measures that lend itself to harm reduction. It's seen as pro-human rights, as addressing the individual needs and compassion of people in a very much broader perspective than just focusing on tobacco, whatever. And I've been very impressed that they, sitting in the heart of Europe, have actually been propagating this as a way forward conceptually. Make sure that tobacco harm reduction is not separate from the rest. The same we saw coming out of St. Kitts and Nevis in the Caribbean. And our hearts and minds need to be with our friends in Jamaica today, actually, as the worst hurricane takes effect. But so the president of the country and led a lot of the Caribbean efforts around the HIV/AIDS world all those years ago to talk about the value of harm reduction. Coming out of that experience, they've now embraced the notion of harm reduction in tobacco. Then more specific examples, and we're seeing the smoking rates among men halved in places like Japan and Korea, and coming down fast in Greece, not because government has made any major shifts, but they've at least allowed a regulated industry to actually take place. Some have actually allowed differentiation between taxation, which I strongly believe is needed. We need to tax tobacco products at the full level you can. And yes, I think you should tax all of the harm reduction products, but in a ratio of maybe 100 to 2 or 3 to reflect the differential risk. The moment you tax and regulate, so if you look to the countries that are regulating and taxing and not banning and prohibiting, I think we're into a good place. That includes China. China regulates the e-cigarette industry. It hasn't banned and prohibited it. That's good news. That creates an opportunity for dialogue. The Philippines is moving ahead as well. In the Middle East, we've seen a real upsurge in many governments either investing directly in some of these products. The Saudi government in the pouch sector, for example, recently the regulatory approach of the UAE, the reversal of bans in Egypt, the strong support across Pakistan for pouches. These things are actually happening. And then across Europe, we have a very strong support on both the quality, the safety issues. We do face enormous threats in Europe. where the Commission of Health, believe it or not, has put out a statement recently saying that tobacco products and these harm reduction products are equivalent in terms of their public health impact. Now, that's just plain false and needs to be addressed. Of course, the US, even though it's been slow and terribly sluggish, but the FDA has been chugging along, authorizing products and getting them out. It needs to clean up the active illegal products on the market. I could go on and on, New Zealand, UK. And of course, then we have the Swedish example where the Swedish government hasn't been aggressively active, but it's certainly permitted and allowed and encouraged the development initially of snus and nicotine pouches, which we now see spread across many countries. So they're many models that actually are derived from their historical root of where they started with harm reduction. Japan on the heated tobacco, Sweden on snus and pouches, the UK, US on vapes, and I suspect the Middle East will start seeing e-shisha products. But I do think that, looking ahead, a couple of issues. I think we spend too much time.
Just before you go ahead, Derek, you left a hole there for Mark to fill on what we call in Canada Canadian content, or CanCon. Where does Canada fit on that spectrum of regimes in terms of tobacco harm reduction?
Not in a good space. I mean, there's so much vocalization by anti-tobacco people. There's provinces across Canada who make their own regulations. There's a whole patchwork of different regulations, from flavor bans to where point of sales are to taxation. But most provinces are trying to compete with each other to have the most restrictive policies they can come up with. So it's really Canada's going backwards. But as Derek said, you can have all the regulations you want, but underneath it is what really what's happening. And so there's 1 million people who are vaping regularly in Canada. So, I mean, regulations exist in some level, and you can argue with them all they want, but an informed population will demand these products, and it's going to happen. And unless we get our regulations in order, most of the activity will be in the illegal market, and will just be flooded with, illegal products.
What advice you have to an individual smoker who might be listening to this? Talk about the future first.
Well, I mean, just a few top line things. I think next month we head into the Conference of the Parties, which is when the governments come together to take stock and look at the Framework Convention. My real hope is that they'll ascribe to the first message of bioethics, which is non-maleficence, do no harm. Let's hope that they go in with the mindset of not doing something that's going to make it tougher for smokers to actually get off their product, which means basically I'd be thrilled if they do nothing, and rather wait for the next Director General race to start heating up and have somebody come in who can then clean ship and actually say, let's have an independent committee led by WHO with the best scientists in the world from all sides to just give us a view of why are we seeing 140 million people out there switching out of their tobacco and toxic tobacco products. Why is the evidence that has become so evidently strong not being taken into account? So that would be my pledge. But I think it's more than that. I think the tobacco industry also needs to step up far more. We still don't have the level of investment in science and research in the countries where most of the smokers live. And you know so well, Peter, from your work, that unless you build the capacity for science and research in countries, particularly in the countries where the smoking rates are highest, from Indonesia to Africa to Asia, you don't have the informed scientists who are able to talk about their products and science in an informed way to the ministries of health. And instead, you're then reliant of what gets sent out from the US and many of the Bloomberg philanthropy people, which may or may not be what we actually want them to hear. So I think there's a real requirement that we see a lot more local, national research, because if you start doing it, there's no question that it'll inspire the local governments. And then I think the final point I'd say in my hope is that while we commit to reducing the harms, we need to ask the question, where do the harms reside in terms of smoking rates and the age of smokers? And the heavier, older smoker has generally been neglected by the way products have been designed and taken up and so on, with a few exceptions. And yet that is where the deaths and disease over the next 20, 30 years will come from. It'll be in the adult smokers today who are in their 40s and 50s. That is where we have the biggest potential for life saving to happen if we were able to reach them. But they're neglected by the physicians who stigmatize them, who believe it's just too late when it's not. The evidence is clear. there's a life expectancy of a decade to be gained. They're neglected by the designers of the tobacco, by the vape products, who tend to go much younger. And our colleagues in the public health community have almost written them off as not being of high value. And I think that going after that group would do what we learned so well in HIV/AIDS. You must go where you're going to start having the immediate gain. Then we will see these numbers we talk about, 3 million deaths to be saved, really being entirely achievable, maybe even more.
Good.
Yeah. No,
Mark,
I think,
anything as you look to the future, anything you'd
well,
like
I
to
mean,
see?
the point about who we're targeting and where that we can get the most mileage out of this is, I think, incredibly important. And we didn't really touch much on health equity. And so in many Western countries, imagine, in Canada, we estimate 13% of adults smoke. Imagine if it was not the 13% of the poorest, most marginalized people, but 13% of the richest people in Canada, and there was a product out there that was 95% safer. Do you think we'd be having these conversations? Of course not. People would demand that, what are you doing, killing me with this? So to me, it's a real health equity issue globally too. I mean, the high smoking rates are in poor countries, and it's really, in the WHO and big organizations, this is what their focus should always be on. We're looking for health equity and to try to bring us up the lowest standard to higher. We've missed the boat on that. And I think, to me, that's a hugely strong argument for these safer products, that it's really comes down to a health equity issue. And and smoking's a health equity issue, educated population in the Western world do not smoke. None of our friends smoke. It's been going on that way for many decades. Like, I didn't even really grow up with my friends smoking, and I'm in my 60s. So this is a long-term health equity issue, both for smoking and now for safer products. And I think we really need to push on that and really corner people. Like, people that are against this, you really push them and say, well, what are you actually doing? Like, who are you helping, and what are you doing? To me, it's just so obvious. If you face somebody face to face and you're a doctor, and you don't offer them a safer product, and you keep year after year just telling them to quit cigarettes because it's going to kill them, to me, it would be equivalent of knowing they're HIV positive and year after year telling them to be healthy and not offering them any treatment, or they have hypertension and never offering them antihypertensive medications. I mean, it's right down to that. So ethically, we can't go on hiding behind the fact that this is a big tobacco thing and that we got to be very scared of it. It comes down to one-on-one human health. And as a doctor, I'd feel terribly unethical not to offer somebody something that will save their lives.
So presumably that would be your advice to an individual smoker who's listening to this. What would you say to them?
I mean, I face them all the time. I mean, I try not to, like, I try to do the compassionate thing. I understand you really like this, but there's something that you could use that it'd be far safer for you. And you really need to look into this. And it's a positive thing. Not only will it prevent you from getting lung cancer, but you'll be able to walk the golf course way better, and you'll be able to go upstairs. You can play with your grandkids. I mean, there's just so many positive things. And in a world, too, where we're focused a lot on wellness and things like this is, to me, the critical part of wellness. So you want your health to be a bit better? And this is the way to do it, because cigarettes are the one thing that you can change, and we have something for you that's even better than cigarettes.
And that something is vaping, smokeless tobacco, tobacco pouches, what we talked about before. Great. All right. Well, that was amazing. It was great to reconnect with you guys and actually put some of these issues on the table. This is not a popular line of argument that you're arguing. It's somehow, you use the word pariah. Eric, you use the experience of being banned from certain premises. People don't like these arguments, but you are arguing them in a very intellectually honest way. And I think the broader issue here is an intellectually honest approach to public health, and that's what you guys have done. And having said that, I have many friends who are on the other side of this argument, and I'd like to invite them to come on to this platform to maybe address any of the points that you made, and even better, if they'd be willing to appear Derek, with you, or with you, Mark, or with both of you, and we could just have an honest discussion, free of the blacklisting, free of the bans, free of the scarlet letter, free of the pariah aspects, because those things are not science and they shouldn't be public health. And that's actually why I wanted to do this particular episode and why I wanted to speak with you two, who've been among the leading advocates for this, what I consider to be a very coherent line of argument that I think requires a response from more traditional public health folks. So thank you very much. Just before we close, any final words you guys want to share, or you've shared enough words already?
I think I've shared enough, but I really appreciate you having us have this discussion. And certainly from my side, and I'm sure Mark agree, I would come onto any discussion with any of my colleagues and have the kind of discussion you're talking about. And these discussions are happening. They tend to be in private meetings and closed meetings, but I think having a broader public discourse would be valuable, because there are obvious downsides that we need to look at. We've got to avoid the youth access issues, as you said. We need to avoid the contaminants in some of these products. And most importantly, we need to focus on those who are desperately in need of support to actually get off their cigarettes or their toxic products to save their lives. So anything to achieve that, I would be more than supportive of. Thank you, enormously.
Thank you, Derek. Mark, any final thoughts?
No, same thing. I mean, it sounds like, Derek, you paint us as kind of being isolated, but it's opened up a whole new world to me. So I'm quite happy to know Derek now. I wouldn't have before. So there's a whole other world out there. So it is fun to, like, it is a engaging group of people. There's some very committed folks out there, and I think the movement is growing. And the more of us that connect, I think the stronger we'll be. And so I do think it, inevitably it's got to happen. It's just that it's just so frustrating that it's taking so long, and so many lives that could be saved we're not saving. But I can't see that cigarettes, the way we produce them and use them, will be the same now as it was in 20 years from now. Things will change dramatically, despite what I say or Derek says or what the opposition says. There's a movement out there to get rid of cigarettes, and it's gonna happen, but it's just how slow it.
Yeah, your main point is that movement is in several parts, but primarily on the part of consumers.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's what's going to drive this. That's your point. Great. Well, thank you guys very much. And hopefully we'll have you back on with some folks who want to argue the other side of this argument, and we can really try and get
for more information,
read the book. It's great.
Read the book, read your report on 100 million lives, Derek, and we'll put that in the show notes. And thank you very much, guys, for coming on. We'll talk to you again soon.
Great.
Bye for now.
Thank you, Peter.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks,
See you,
Peter.
Derek.